Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more overly sarcastic productions, and this time we are saving the world. Hold on. Eh, Here we go. Do it again. Anyways, before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love if you join the Discord and follow me over at Twitch. Now, this trope is perhaps the most, honestly, probably, arguably the most common one because that's kind of like almost what all stories devolve into, especially if you are dealing with a situation where you're writing like a lot of this is honestly what a lot of series that authors writers don't want to let go of, or say they are contractually obligated to keep the story going, like, or for whatever reason, a lot of the time this is eventually it reaches this point because it is a simple way of elevating threat, and making elevating the stakes so that because if you have minor, you usually start off with pretty small stakes. You don't really start off with save the world as a stake. You start off pretty minor and then it grows from there, right? Because it's just the easiest way to do it. Um, and it's a way of power growth if you're trying to show that character development, things like that. Have the character going from the small scale to saving the fucking world, right? Or you have Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee who just go from being little hobbits to saving the world, because that was part of the whole theme of them, and whatnot. Their whole theme, like even the smallest person can save the world. That was the theme there. But yeah, typically stories don't just like dive into the save the world thing, but like almost all stories also have it. Um, at least our modern stories, I feel like we see this a lot in. This is definitely a trope overutilized, I feel like, in superheroes. And I think it's a problem that the MCU is dealing with, is after Thanos, where do you go from there? How do you go and scale things back down for the individual movies and shows so that you can then build up another threat that is supposed to be more dangerous than Thanos, right? And I don't think it's not working for me. What they've released so far has not been working. So, will the MCU be able to do it? Who knows? Obviously, if you had talked about what the MCU was planning to do or wanting to build towards back in like 2010, 2011 with the first Avengers, um, people back then probably would have said, "You're fucking crazy. It's not going to work." Obviously it did work. So, I'm open to it. I enjoyed the Infinity Saga for the most part, but right now they haven't been hooking me with anything. I just haven't been keeping up at all. I have no interest to keep up. Anyways, save the world. Let's dive in.
You know, saving the world didn't used to be such a big thing in storytelling. Even the great hero stories were usually about perilous quests through dangerous terrain or epic monster slaying or something. The entire planet was never really up for grabs, or if it was generally a cyclic, symbolic thing being handled by gods whose job was specifically to do that. Monsters that threatened to eat the sun were certainly a staple of equatorial pyramid building societies, but it wasn't like they ever came close to succeeding. And you certainly had belief systems that attested a prophesied end of the world. Ragnarok is the big one, but you've also got the Rapture and stuff like that. But for the most part, those were just inevitable. It wasn't anyone's endgame to stop them. Heroes never had to save the world. Now, there was one major subversion to this rule, and that's Vishnu. As the god of preserving the world, Vishnu routinely...
So I think perhaps, honestly, I think what this might also get attributed to, I'm curious. This is a complete shot in the dark, a complete, like, perhaps even a reach, maybe. But I I think you could argue the World War II and then the invention of the nuclear bomb which then brought about the nuclear arms race and the Cold War in the later half of the 20th century, is why we have this trope. Because now, what is now realistic to our mindset is humanity has the direct means of ending the world with a simple push of a button, right? We've always been capable of essentially destroying the world. We've known the harmful effects of fossil fuels since we started using them for vehicles, right? There are papers talking about, hey, if we mass produce and mass use this stuff, this is going to be harmful to the planet. Um, we've known that, right? Um, but it was something that takes a long time to happen, right? It doesn't happen, especially for the people in the 1900s. That stuff was not going to happen in their lifetimes. It's happening in our lifetime. The possible, you know, ruining of this world for humanity to survive on. Um, that isn't the destruction through nuclear weapons. But yeah, nuclear weapons was our creation that can end the world quickly within like a blink of an eye. The world can end. Um, so I think largely nuclear weapons are the reason why we have this trope of saving the world.
Incarnated in order to save it. That's the whole shtick behind the Dashavataras. Whenever the general cosmic order was out of whack, Vishnu showed up in mortal form to fix it, sometimes with the help of a posse of mortal buddies. But beyond that, saving the world was hardly ever in the folkloric cards, and there's one really obvious reason for why that is. Before human society got globally connected, there was no comprehensive idea of what the world actually meant. Everyone's concept of the world was basically the known world, pretty much meaning their local area. A folk hero might save their city or repel an army that threatened to take over their country, an exiled king might wander through a number of neighboring empires before reclaiming his throne, but the fact is, up until quite recently, the world was basically the neighborhood, and there was no global consensus that got any bigger than that. And as a result, you didn't get save the world stories, you got save your world stories, where you saved your kingdom or your people, not your planet. Oh, and real quick, before we really get going, big
And I would also say though that we still get that. I'd say that is perhaps still predominant. Um, like we still, I feel like, get that a lot in stories. Especially when they add in otherworldly threats. And we kind of see this discussion. I think I saw a clip of um um Samuel L. Jackson's character in the MCU. And he was talking to one of the scrolls or something, and it was about universal threats and keeping Earth safe or things like that. And what was said sounded pretty interesting. I don't know how well the show actually handled the discussion, if they actually were, handled it well or not. Um, but it essentially became a little bit of a discussion of, at least what it sounded like to me without having watched the show and probably never will, not interested in the MCU anymore. Um, the discussion of more isolationism of Earth versus opening Earth up to help global society kind of thing. And largely, I think this actually might be a more American sort of concept now. That kind of questioning, because it's essentially um, the concept of, do we isolate the United States or be a more present global police force kind of sort of situation kind of thing? Which there's a lot to fucking go through in that, and I'm not going to. Um, but yeah, we still get this that save your world. I feel like kind of also ends up blending into this. I don't know. I'm probably thinking way too broadly. This might be one of the ones where Red gets pretty specific here.
thanks to subscriber T. Ellery Hodges for sponsoring this video. Stick around to the end to hear more about his award-winning new book, The Never Hero. Anyway, back on track. The idea that the world is only the known world isn't true anymore, because we live in a connected world and
God, I'd love to have the money and advertising budget to hire Red to shout out my work. Oh my god, that would be so good. That would be so fucking cool. Y'all make me rich as fuck. Make me a millionaire so I can pay Overly Sarcastic Productions to shout out my book. Sponsor so I can sponsor them. Ah, the dreams. Oh, I have so many good ideas for marketing for a book, but let me tell you, I first got to get a fucking agent and then I've got to get a fucking publisher. You know, I have the ideas, but I can't do anything with them.
And as a result, the modern notion of the world actually approximates what the world really is. And with this clearer grasp of what the world is, the concept of the world as a whole being threatened starts to make a little more sense. And as a result, those smaller scale apocalypses that were such a staple of epics and folklore don't feel quite so apocalyptic anymore. I mean, Pompeii used to be considered apocalyptic, but now major cities getting totaled in movies is practically set dressing. Somewhere along the
Yeah.
globalization line, heroes got bigger and stakes got badder. It wasn't enough to steal fire from the gods, you also had to stop them from turning North America into a ping pong table. You weren't just fighting an enemy army, you were preventing them from hollowing out the earth. The end of the world wasn't a cosmic hypothetical or god-driven inevitable anymore, it was a clear and present danger, and more importantly, one you could
I do agree with the way in which she's describing this, but I still think largely the fear of the world ending, um, and perhaps even the concept of a global identity did not come about until we've really come to realize how easily we can destroy it with nuclear bombs. I still believe nuclear the nuclear race is the reason why this trope grew so much as it did. Because unless she starts pointing out a bunch of stories taking place that were written before the 1930s, I'm going to say this trope largely came about due to World War II and the arms race.
stop. Now, you still get stories where the entire world isn't at stake, just the parts that matter to the heroes. And although that used to be what saving the world meant, today we're going to be talking mostly about the big saving the world thing, where if the heroes fail, the consequences will impact literally everybody. But even using this unforgiving yardstick, there's still something of a scale present. The smaller scale apocalypses are the ones that wipe out a lot of people and leave the world forever scarred and changed, like a zombie apocalypse. But these apocalypses are actually frequently pushed through by the author without a saving the world storyline. And this is because an apocalypse on this scale leaves enough of a world and a population for a writer to still write in, and nothing produces easy angst like being forced to shoot your loved ones in the face. So a lot of the time, these low-level apocalypses slip by under the radar and don't actually get stopped by your heroes, only damage controlled after the fact. For an example of that, consider Berserk, where the eclipse event in volume 13 of the manga unleashes demons on the world, but most of the story happens afterwards. Moving up the apocalypse scale, you get the mid-range kind, where humanity goes extinct, or will get so
I probably should read Berserk. I've heard good things about it.
close to extinction that it'll never recover. This one also has a rather more kid-friendly variant, where instead of dying, all of humanity instead falls under the influence of some kind of horrible monster king or whatever and stays that way forever. This is a variant where you can afford to have the world end a little bit before the heroes manage to win the day, because it won't immediately damage the world beyond repair. It's actually fairly common for the evil king to have mostly won, or even totally won, for at least an episode before the heroes manage to actually step in and save the world. Whatever the case, then
What fucking show is this? This must have been made after I stopped watching Cartoon Network, which I stopped watching Cartoon Network in like 2012, 2011, because we stopped having cable in my house back then, and Netflix didn't have everything. Yeah, Netflix was really the only thing Netflix had back then was Avatar: The Last Airbender that I watched anyway, that I remember. Uh, and so I watched that once, and then I didn't use Netflix like at all throughout high school because it didn't start. I don't think it really started having everything on it until 2016, maybe around there. I want to say. Um, but like throughout high school, and honestly, still to this day, my TV is just YouTube and Twitch. It's kind of what I just watch, unless House of the Dragon. It's House of the Dragon season or something like that. Um, but I do need to get Netflix back so that I can watch the latest 2 seasons of The Dragon Prince because I have fallen behind.
been totally won for at least an
Now
episode
that they
before the
finally
heroes manage
released
to
the
actually
seasons.
step in and save the world. Whatever the case, the nefariousness that needs thwarting will make everything awful forever and absolutely must be fixed now, or at least soon. This also happens in the popular rage mind control apocalypse scenario, where all of humanity goes crazy and turns on itself. Usually this will be allowed to continue for 3 to 5 minutes at most before your heroes shut it down. And the
Yeah.
biggest scale of apocalypse is basically everything gets destroyed. Whether everything is the planet, or the solar system, or the entire dimension, it doesn't matter. Practically speaking, this is the apocalypse that cannot be allowed to happen because there's no coming back from it. This is the one that your heroes absolutely must stop, or like time rewind to fix. An evil king or a deadly virus is whatever, but there's no synthesizing a cure or orchestrating an assassination for your planet getting eaten by Galactus. Ironically, this one shows up a lot in kid-friendly cartoons and comics, since it's kind of a clean, pretty apocalypse where the world just blinks out of existence one day. Nothing as viscerally horrifying as a nuclear winter or a zombie plague. So, now that we've talked about the 3 general scales of peril that the world can potentially be heroically scooped out of, I think we're missing the answer to one crucial question. Why do people keep writing these? Saving the world is a lot of fun, of course, lots
Please tell me she agrees with my prediction.
of tension,
I
exciting
guess.
status quo shakeups, but that's not really sufficient to explain why it shows up so much. There are plenty of fun tropes that aren't nearly as prevalent as this one. So why? One word: stakes. High stakes are great.
Y'all, I'm getting good at at guessing this series, at guessing how Red is gonna like tackle these tropes and what she's gonna say. Cause stakes, baby, I said that right at the beginning. Let's go. Pew pew.
Right? Freak out your audience, keep them invested, raise the stakes is like the first rule authors are taught these days. And it kinda makes sense. You want every story twist to be bigger and badder than the last one, otherwise your audience will be all, oh man, this is so boring, I'm gonna go watch a video of increasingly sizable
Now, one thing that we are starting to see, I think, become a bit perhaps more prevalent, maybe, isn't that the stakes aren't as big. And I think the Poppy War actually ended up doing this, where in the first book, we get the sight of purely catastrophic powers. And that fear of the powers spreading and like ending the world it is kind of a thing to think about as the series goes on. But in the finale, in the final book, that really isn't like the twist there isn't about necessarily the end of the world and what the powers can do. It kind of ends up being a lot more softer. I don't know if softer is the right word, but a lot more personal and smaller and technically smaller in scale. And I thought that was really well done. And that's kind of something I really like as well. I like that kind of twisting this trope, and having these big scale things, um, and then like maybe the next story you do that involves these characters, the next big issue that they have to do is the stakes are big because the stakes are harder and bigger than the previous one, not because perhaps of overall destructive threat, but because the way in which this new threat is challenging our protagonists is challenging them in a way that they are perhaps not best suited for, right? Let's say we're going to go very simple in our example here. Let's say you have a great warrior prince or something, a great knight, someone who's great at fighting. So the first threat they deal with is one that they can just beat in combat, right? They win a battle. And then in the next book, their threat turns political. And we see this one, I feel like this one is the most common example of this kind of twist on the save the world trope. Because we see this in the Mistborn trilogy. Book 1, Vin is a fighter, very much a fighter. Book 2 becomes more of a political. It's not entirely accurate to call it a political drama, because what Vin is really good at fighting, and using her Mistborn powers, that ends up becoming a way to solve things uh, and deal with the problem at the end. But like throughout that story, overall, it becomes no longer a blatant use of the power, but instead, hey, we have to do things politically this time, or we have to maneuver through the politics. We can't just like march up to um, the bad guy and kill him this time around. We have to worry about the other things happening around so that what we are trying to build here lasts beyond our lives. That essentially becomes the theme of exploration, I think, in Mistborn 2 and Mistborn 3 really becomes about saving the world. Uh, but Mistborn 2 was like a twist, did something different than books 1 and 3. Book 2 also was the weakest, I feel like, out of that trilogy for me, but, you know, I can still respect the attempt that was made in it. It's just there's something about the because it was one of Sanderson's early works, you know, it didn't, you know, I think maybe if he were to rewrite it today with his current skill, he would be very capable of doing it, but you know, yeah. Yeah.
explosions to renew my interest in life. If the stakes aren't high, why does your audience care? And what situation is more high stakes than the end of the world as we know it? So there's a problem here. Basically, everything I just said is wrong. A higher stakes situation with more to lose does not automatically translate into a more invested audience, and a lower stakes situation with less to lose doesn't automatically lose your audience. The degree to which your audience will be invested and concerned is based entirely on how uncertain the outcome of a situation is, not on how bad things can get if it does go south. And unfortunately, most audiences are genre savvy enough to recognize that if the stakes are too high, there's no way for the author to justify letting the heroes fail. That's why a catastrophic potential apocalypse can feel tedious rather than dire, but a character overcoming their personal trauma and opening themselves up to others can feel like the tensest thing in the world. It's not a matter of scale, but of
And this is why I think it worked in why Mistborn is such a really good like Sanderson does this a lot. This is how he gets around the issue of the saving the world trope and making the audience actually genuinely be a little worried. For one, he also writes super thick books, so he gives, you know, the audience trusts. He's built up a trust with the audience enough now that he can write these super thick books and give plenty of like information for us to then get invested, right? Um, New authors like me or you cannot do that. We are limited in our words. Our books, if you are wanting your best chance at getting an agent and such, you are wanting to limit your work to around 100,000 to 150,000 words for a debut epic fantasy novel. Now, there are, of course, outliers that are able to write more than that and then they still get representation, but the majority, 100 to 150,000, the 100, honestly, pushing over 120,000 is pushing it. When I did research, they largely want a 100,000 to 110,000 word book from a debut fantasy author, um, which comes out to around 350 pages or something like that. I think I'm not sure. I can't remember. Um, but uh, with the standard layout of Google Docs that I'm remembering off the top of my head. But Mistborn, I feel like does this really well. I've only read the first two books in the Stormlight Archives, so I'm not far enough in to really say much on them. But the first era Mistborn does this really well because of the mystery in the last Hero of Ages, and the last time like the Well of Ascension was used by a hero and all that. The mystery that Sanderson develops around that and the way he manipulates the information that we have access to because of things happening in the world and what the villain, the ultimate bad guy, is capable of influencing. That is so he was so fucking genius, right? Like even though perhaps the actual material itself may not be there are flaws because it's one of his earlier works, that the overarching like topic and like just the concept itself, so fucking genius. And obviously for the most part he nails he in this regard, I think he absolutely nails the landing for that writing, for like keeping the mystery regarding the last time like the Well of Ascension and all these like superpowers were used. He does a really good of keeping that mystery and twisting it and things like that to keep us invested the entire time and not think uh to be actually genuinely be worried that the world is going to end. um and he also has no problem killing characters, killing characters that we do like. um yeah.
skill and execution. This is part of why small-scale save-the-world stories can be more effective than large-scale ones. If the planet blows up if you mess up, there's no way you're gonna mess up. The rules won't allow it. Now, I have seen this scenario subverted once, and it was hilarious. In a recent-ish Dragon Ball Z movie, the destruction god Beerus said he was gonna blow up the Earth unless Goku beat him. Goku does the unthinkable and loses, at which point Beerus blows up a small rock, and says he'll be back for the rest of the Earth eventually, but first he has to eat as much dessert as he possibly can find, because as the B-plot of this movie, Beerus discovers that Earth has the greatest desserts in the universe. It was hilarious, but I haven't seen it done anywhere else. In general, if failure means total annihilation, failure is quite literally not an option, because total annihilation isn't an option from the writer's perspective. The reflex from the author side of things is to make
Now this, it depends, right? You could end up having like, it really depends on the author's goal. If the author wants to return to this world and have it continue as a series, which ends up because of, especially if the story sells well, audience expectation is, yo, we're probably going to get more stories here. He's not going to end the world. And the author is not going to end the world. But if you have an author who just wants to write a series and then end it and then be done with that series, then I think the fear of the world ending is legitimate, right? Like when we look at George R. R. Martin, the fear of that world ending is real because we know that George is not going to write beyond the story of A Song of Ice and Fire. He's going to finish the Duncan Egg Tales, or well, he wants to finish the Duncan Egg Tales and tell Fire and Blood Part 2. But outside of that, we are not getting any more information. And all the Fire and Blood Part 2 and the Duncan Egg Tales are set in the past from the main story. So, the fear that our heroes, our protagonists, that the others are going to succeed and end the world is a legitimate fear that we can have while reading A Song of Ice and Fire. But that's also because we know the author, right? So, right? It's
make things
complex.
more and more dire, because if your characters are freaking out because they might fail, your audience has to feel the same way, right? But unfortunately, after you reach a certain degree of direness, your audience investment starts actually going down, because genre savviness is a cruel, cruel mistress, and even if your audience wants to be worried, they might not be able to suspend their disbelief hard enough to actually pull it off. The audience might.
And also, what helps George with the Song of Ice and Fire thing, and what he's very smart about, is the war for the War of the Five Kings, right? The war for the Iron Throne being used as a means of distraction, right? Both in universe and out of universe to pull away from the threat of the others. And because so many characters continue to be just drawn to the Iron Throne, whereas we only really have Jon Snow and by the end of the first 5 books, which potentially could be the last of the books. We may never get 6 and 7. Stannis begins to start considering the world itself and not just the throne. Although Stannis looks at it as, I have to win the throne so that I am in a position to help, right? That's kind of Stannis's point of view of it. Is like, no one else is going to do it. I have to do it myself. And from the Iron Throne, I will be able to fight the others. That's his view. And I think Jon largely agrees with him. Jon, right? Jon is telling people, yo, we have to fucking work together here with the wildlings to fight this coming threat. We are in danger, and it feels like no one is listening to him. Except for the wildlings, really. And that is why I think the fear of the world ending in A Song of Ice and Fire really works, because of all of these outside things in play. So if you want to save the world, the end of the world to be a genuine threat, you have to throw in like pretty much red herrings and distractions to the audience and for characters within the world that can potentially set them up for ruin to be in a position unable to fight the coming threat, right? Um, like the war for the Iron Throne is draining Westeros of its resources, of its food, because land is being pillaged and burned. It is losing its population because people are killing each other instead of being, put on reserve to prepare and train for the coming White Walker threat, right? So you have all these things playing into the risk of world gonna fucking end.
Believe the author is willing to kill a beloved character or destroy everything a character
And then also because George killed Robb Stark.
cares about, but almost nobody will believe an author would actually destroy the world if the heroes fail. The stakes are, paradoxically, too high for us to care. And here's a weirder problem with a Save the World plotline. Sometimes it feels like the author or characters forget the stakes they're dealing with.
And again, George does this really well, is the other characters may be completely ignoring the threat, but he establishes Jon pretty early on. Jon cares about other people. He's a caring person. Although he can be pretty cold, he's very much like a Stark. To his friends and family, he's fucking diehard loving. To those that wrong him, fucking cold.
Pretty routinely, you'll get some villain of the week with the power and plan to conquer or destroy the world, and equally routinely, this will be treated with about the same level of severity as any other villain of the week. Nobody seems to care. I mean, this is the whole world we're talking about. Logically, the characters should be feeling the full magnitude of their mission and everything that's at stake if they fail. Instead, you get cheerful, normal interactions wherein everybody knows they're saving the world as they know it, but it's apparently no biggie, or they spend way more time focusing on a single smaller thing that might be.
And then I feel like this largely comes up in superhero when superheroes do this.
Stake, like a friend or a
really in
MacGuffin.
fantasy,
This is
like.
probably because most writers treat putting the world in jeopardy as an easy bit of stakes-raising set dressing without actually considering how that would feel. I mean, hell, it's an actual trope on TV tropes that the world is constantly in peril and it's specifically treated as a running gag. It's utterly bizarre. It's like we've exhausted the trope to the point where it doesn't feel real anymore. You get a similar problem when you try to kill off characters, since there are frankly too many ways for people to get resurrected in popular media that it can be hard for your audience to buy that a major character is legit dead. I talked about this in the character deaths trope talk, so I won't go into much detail here, but basically it's the same problem on a much larger scale. Jeopardizing the world barely registers as a threat because it is never followed through on. By its very nature, the trope does not allow itself to be subverted at its highest level. You can't get away with destroying the world your story is built on if you want to be able to write a story afterwards. And as a result, nobody, not your audience, not your characters, and probably not you, can really wrap their head around the stakes of the world falling.
And actually, as I've written more, I've actually become more accepting of the idea of genuinely ending the world, because I've come to realize that a lot of the fun, right? It is fun to explore the world and have things fleshed out. However, from both what is more entertaining for the audience and for me as a writer is leaving mystery. So like if I were to really write everything, then the world is just going to be there's not going to be much left to discuss when it comes to my world, right? Essentially, if I were to write everything, all you would be able to discuss is like characters and they're like you wouldn't be able to wonder like let's say I have this heroic character that's mentioned in the past, this heroic character of the past who died tragically. They, you have these heroes the protagonists and stuff mentioning this character. And then I go and write the story of that character. So that essentially cheapens the previous story, because now you know the truth. You know the facts of that character's life. So right now you're like, oh well, that character is wrong about that bit of information, right? You may be able to appreciate the what is done within the story. You might be able to appreciate, oh wow, that this character is being misremembered for these things or whatever. You may be able to appreciate that, and there may be a sort of tragicness around that. But I think what is more entertaining, more fulfilling, and would even drive more discussion because you want people to talk about your work. People talking about your work is how your work is going. Word of mouth is how books sell. There's no other way books sell. Word of mouth. That is literally the only way. And a successful film adaptation, but really the film adaptation only comes to be because of word of mouth. Unless you have insider connections, blah blah blah. But you know, people discussing like, oh, what this character said, is that true? And then they use like all the other information that is being said about the character of the past that has died tragically, blah blah, that you're never going to get the story of. Discussing what may or may not have been, I feel like is so much more rewarding. And while there's a part of it that is a little frustrating, like, oh, I'll never know the full truth, being able to come up to your own conclusions, I feel like is way more satisfying from a reading and writing perspective. Of course, I, as the writer, know exactly the truth of the situation. Because if you don't know the truth of the situation, then you're not going to be able to lie to the audience, right? You have to know the truth entirely within that regard. You have to know, like, did this character actually do this? How exaggerated is this event that is attributed to them going to be, right? Or is it going to be undervalued? That sort of thing, right? You got to know the real of it to then either undervalue or over exaggerate. But yeah, I'm like, when I first started writing, I was like, I want to tell a story for every single, you know, event that I'm writing here in the world lore. Now I'm like, no, I don't want to do that.
falling apart in one way or another. As a result of this, some of the most effective plots for getting your audience invested are the ones where the world isn't actually fully at stake. Hell, you can make a tense, uncertain, audience-enthralling plotline about something as small-scale as a single character coming to terms with a fact of their life, without anybody's continued well-being having to be on the line, and it'll be way more personally engrossing than any number of catastrophic meteor drop scenarios. And to be honest, I don't think this is fully because Save the World stories are predictable, I just think we have trouble wrapping our heads around anything that large scale. This is one of those real-world things that seems to be an actual perception limit. Like, humans aren't.
I'm gonna disagree here just because I think we can wrap our minds around the destruction of the world. It's just that, one, humanity doesn't want to. I think we can perceive it. It's that we don't want to actively perceive the notion of a world ending and having it be legitimate. We want, in our fantasy, I think in our stories here, we don't want the world to end for real within the story, because then what we'll be left with is the legitimate fear that our world can end the same way. I think we like the idea of, we know our world can end. We can end our world within the blink of an eye with a push of a button, but we like to tell ourselves that it can never happen. And I think that's for me, in my eyes, part of the problem with, and not the perception thing, but that is the problem.
Really built to deal with anything much bigger than a few hundred people in one horizon's worth of terrain. I mean, how many of us have had a full-on existential crisis just by looking up at the sky on a clear night, or stood at the base of a mountain
I just have an existential crisis when I stand still.
just too big to comfortably think about? When something skirts the edge of our perception limit, we feel a sense of wonder and awe, but when it gets too big, we kind of just lose track of it. It's like when something gets too enormous, we can't even really conceive of it properly. So when you have a story where the world is at stake, usually in order to keep the audience practically invested, you have to focus down to what personally this means to me, because your audience probably can't really comfortably conceive of the entire world ceasing to exist. There's just too much going on there. They can potentially conceive of everything they care about ceasing to exist and recognize how terrible that would be, but if you say the world will be destroyed, that doesn't automatically make the person think, oh no, all of these important things I care about are part of the world. So when you have a story where the world is at stake, usually in order to keep the audience practically invested, it focuses down to what personally this means to our heroes. Your character is saving the world, but he's doing it because he wants to save the girl he loves and the friends he made. And you know what happens a disturbing amount of the time? That girlfriend gets kidnapped and the hero is willing to sacrifice the world if it means saving her. That's stupid. But it makes more sense to us than the alternative, because a person you care about feels way more real than the world, even though the world contains every single person you care about. Now, of course, one convenient consequence of the whole "the world is a little too big for us to really conceive of" thing is that you can write out a scenario that feels like the end of the world without actually having to nearly end the world. And for this, we loop back to the very beginning, where I was talking about those things that don't count as apocalypses anymore. That is, the destruction of your world. Now, for this one, I'm gonna pull out a majorly spoiler example from Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, so if you're watching that show, I'd suggest skipping this next part. In the backstory of Fullmetal Alchemist, the kingdom of Xerxes is completely destroyed in what amounts to a huge alchemic ritual that rips out the souls of everyone in the city and funnels them into a philosopher's stone at the exact center of the city. Everyone dies except for the character von Hohenheim, the father of our two protagonists, who ends up with half of those souls. The other half go to this shadowy little homunculus guy, who uses the power those souls give him to get himself a body and start putting together a plan to eat God. The climax of the story involves that same homunculus attempting to recreate that same ritual on a much grander scale. The suspiciously circular country of Amestris has been molded for exactly this purpose over the past several centuries. Maze Hughes, everyone's favorite character, uncovers this conspiracy in episode 10, well before any other characters or the audience figures it out, and is promptly murdered in the first majorly upsetting moment in the series, so this whole thing is kind of a big deal. If the homunculus succeeds, everyone in Amestris will die, and he'll have the power to consume an entity that's probably God, and certainly way too close to being God for comfort. This plot is not world-ending. It'll depopulate a sizable country and put ultimate power in the hands of an unstable maniac on the far side of the Bishonen line, but it won't crack the planet in half or anything. But it doesn't have to, because when that countrywide circle does activate and we see a montage of everyone we've ever met in the series tipping over, it feels about as apocalyptic as it gets. And it's not even like this is the only country we know about in the story. There are at least 4 major characters from Xing, and we see the Briggs soldiers fighting off an army from Drachma, but because Amestris is where the entire story has happened, it's enough of a world for us to feel really scared when it feels like it's gonna fall apart. Now, spoiler warning, none of those people stay dead. Literally 2 minutes later, Hohenheim counteracts the whole thing and everyone gets their souls back, but those are some stressful goddamn minutes. So the short of it is, a world-ending apocalypse scenario can ironically feel significantly less high-stakes intense than a slightly smaller scale catastrophe, and saving the world plotlines have basically no tension anymore, because what are you gonna do? Actually destroy the world? Probably
Yes.
not. So, yeah. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this video that
And that was Trope Talk, Save the World. I've got nothing to add here. I spoke quite a lot. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button. I really did not think I would talk as much as I did in this episode. Ooh, I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.